I'm Christopher Lydon. This is The Connection. Justice is referred to as the first virtue of human communities. It's also one of the first mysteries of systematic thinking. Barefoot in Athens 2.5 millennia ago, Socrates asked, "What is justice?" Americans today can ask more or less ruefully whether the convicted murderer Gary Graham, who was executed in Texas last night, got justice. Do we know justice when we see it? Is justice a kind of truth in itself? Or is justice rather a deal we make so as to live together, a compromise of our individual selfishness and righteousness that would otherwise make social life impossible? And is justice in that sense a relative term, a rounding off of the rival claims of our individuality? In this second in a summer series of conversations on the central questions of philosophy, Connection listeners, we can also ask the question that Socrates asked: where do you place justice on the list of good things in general, like health, wealth, and wisdom, or life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness? Is justice one item on the list, or is it implicated in all the others? And has there ever been, can there ever be, a standard of justice that applies to all times and all places? What is justice, Connection listeners? Our guides this hour are Bernard Williams, professor of moral philosophy at Oxford University, who joins us from England, and in our studio, Michael Sandel, professor of political philosophy at Harvard. The Justice Connection phone is 1-800-423-8255, or 1-800-423-TALK. Professor Williams, the foundational philosophers in the Western tradition, Plato and Aristotle, both lived with slavery, which seems to break all the rules of justice. Aristotle, in particular, justified slavery. Can you get us out of that contradiction to start with?
Yes, well, I think the first thing to notice is that what Aristotle tried to do, which was to justify slavery, to show that it was just, was rather a rare enterprise in the ancient world. I think that the prevailing attitude in the ancient world wasn't so much that slavery was just as that it was necessary. They thought that, they believed that it was a necessary institution for sustaining the level of culture and sophistication and civilization that they enjoyed. Now, Aristotle's supposed justification of slavery is entirely dependent on a psychological theory about what human beings are like, which barely makes sense in his own terms. It's hardly coherent, actually. And one thing it's particularly not very coherent about is the things that slaves in the ancient world were asked to do. I mean, he justifies it in terms of there being some people who are effectively just hewers of wood and drawers of water, really. But actually, slaves did quite a number of quite complicated and sophisticated tasks of various kinds. And so the justification didn't really even make sense. And I think that he would have done better not to try to say that slavery was just, but to say it was an unjust institution which was necessary for other goods.
We no longer justify slavery, but would you say we still rationalize injustice on the basis of so-called necessity?
Yes, I do think we do that. It's my own view. I think that we fundamentally believe that the level of life that we have, and I don't just mean by that material goods, but we mean also the very idea of running a society with complex and sophisticated institutions and having a culture and all these things, that they depend upon the working of an economic system of which many particular consequences can scarcely be defended as just, unless you take the view that, anything is just that serves the best purposes. And I think that just empties the notion of justice of all content, really.
Professor Williams, give us your own definition, a working definition of justice.
Well,
but
I don't think there is one overall definition of justice, though in fact, in a way there ought to be, because you've got to remember we don't just deal with justice in social distribution, whether our institutions are just and whether people get a fair deal. We also, as you reminded us at the beginning, deal with it with regard to retribution, criminal justice, people being punished and so on. And we've got to think what binds those two ideas together. And one notion, that's probably the best idea, but it's terribly vague, is that justice consists in giving each person what that person deserves or what is appropriate to them or something like that. Now, that formula does sort of cover the whole scene, but of course it's terribly vague, and different societies, different cultures give it a different content. But I guess that in a modern society, our idea of distributive justice, I'm not now talking so much about the criminal part, but distributive justice, is that people should have a fair share or fair chance of a share or something like that of the society's product, of what we regard as good things.
Do you have an ideal of a just society or the just society?
Well, I have an idea. I myself do have certain ideas of that kind. For instance, it seems to me that it should be the aim of a government to bring it about that people do not suffer undeservedly grave or indeed serious harms of various kinds, and that they should certainly have fair access to the benefits that our societies have to offer, such as education, culture, and so on. And, of course, I'm very well aware of the fact that the only way that anybody has invented of trying to bring out that result in a capitalist society is by redistributive taxation. And, of course, we're living at a present time in which we find both that that's very unpopular, and, of course, there are a lot of beliefs that it's pretty ineffective, too. It doesn't always work.
Michael Sandel in our studio in Boston. What's your approach to justice?
Well, let me first say hello to Bernard, who is not only a friend, but a philosopher whose work I've enormously admired for so long, as do really all philosophers. So it's a pleasure to be with you.
Hello, Michael. Very nice to talk with you.
So I would just really pick up on Bernard's general formulation that justice is a matter of giving people what they're due or what they deserve. And, of course, that raises the question, what do people deserve? And I think there are three basic ways that philosophers have answered that question. One of them is the idea of justice as fit. To take the example of slavery that we were just discussing, that slavery is just only if it fits the nature of the people who wind up being slaves. A second conception would be justice as utility, utility being the philosophy that says look to the greatest good for the greatest number. And on that theory, we treat justly with people when we treat them in a way or according to rules that serve the general welfare. And the third conception is justice as rights, or respect for rights of people to choose their values and ends for themselves. This is, if the idea of fit is more familiar among the ancient philosophers, the idea of justice as rights and respect for autonomy is more prominent among contemporary philosophers. But I think these are three different ways that philosophers have carved up the terrain of justice. And just to take the example of slavery, on the first one, slavery is only just if it fits the nature of the people who are slaves. On the second one, justice is utility. Slavery is just only if it turns out that the balance of welfare is served by having some who are slaves and some who are free. And if it turns out slavery causes too much suffering, then utilitarianism would condemn it. And finally, on the third idea, the more familiar contemporary idea, the injustice of slavery would consist in the fact that it coerces people, that it violates people's rights to choose their roles for themselves. This is a different way of condemning slavery from the ancient way to which Bernard alluded, which would depend on showing that slavery actually doesn't fit human nature.
Well, we like the idea of justice as an individual right, partly because it makes certain sort of horrors like slavery impossible, but then it also suggests that individual rights could override the social good even in a crunch, right?
Yeah.
I mean, if I have a right to 3 square meals a day, it should mean I get them whether the society can afford them or not.
Yes,
or whether I have to take them from somebody else. Or
yes, and if you really want to put the rights approach to the test, you could imagine an example, classic example of of a bomb having been planted under Manhattan, let's say, a terrorist. You have a suspect you strongly believe, have good reason to believe that this suspect is the terrorist who knows where the bomb is planted. It will go off in 5 minutes and destroy all of Manhattan unless you find it. Is it just to torture that terrorist suspect to find out the location of the bomb? From the standpoint of rights, obviously not. There's been no due process. It's a violation of individual rights to do so. But doesn't utility argue that maybe in that kind of case, rights should give way and the torture would be justified? That's the puzzle, anyhow, that brings out that clash.
Can I put in a remark?
Bernard Williams, please.
Here, Michael. I agree with a lot of what Michael Sandel just said. I don't believe that there is a concept of justice which consists simply in utility. I think that what Michael said last, namely that notions of rights and also related notions of justice stand against the mere balance of utility, must be right, must be correct. I don't think straight utilitarians, people who believe simply in maximizing welfare, have a need or much of a place in the notion of justice. And in fact, in the terrorist case, my own view is that it's not described as whether it would be just to do it. The question is whether in that emergency case, justice is overridden by utility. That seems to be a possibility. But of course, what we're often dealing with is something different, which really is about what's just in terms of conflict of rights. Because of course, if people say, on the one hand, that people have a right to 3 square meals a day, and that involves taxing people, then those who are resistant to taxation will say, well, earners have a right to keep their money. In that case, these other people can't have a right to 3 square meals a day. It may be a nice idea for them to have it, but they haven't got a right to it. That's what they'll say. That's how the dispute about justice will go on in terms of how does a conflict of rights work out and who has a right to what.
Go back to the claims of justice itself. For example, in the war around Bosnia, for example, nobody really thought that peace was just, but everybody thought peace was better than war or a continuation of the killing. How often, Professor Williams, do we want to rise above the claims of justice?
Oh, well, actually, I think that we do have to do that. I think we do that with regard to notions of economic necessity, though it's been a great aspiration of liberal societies to try to make their fundamental institutions just. And to go back to what Michael Sandel was saying, there's then a question about whether we can explain that entirely in terms of rights, which tends to be an American approach, or whether we need other notions as well. But actually, in the matter of warfare, I think one of the reasons why we think we should get involved in some such war, such as the Bosnian, is for 2 reasons. That we think that a state or a group are behaving unjustly in an international sense. That is, that there is an unjust aggression going on because countries or tribes of people can perform injustice as well as individuals. And secondly, because we think the state of war leads to huge injustices to individuals, and we're trying to stop them in trying to stop a war.
I think that
Michael Sandel.
I agree very much that justice is not the only value, and sometimes it has to compete with other principles. If I could just go back quickly to the issue of utilitarian accounts of justice, I agree very much with Bernard Williams that those accounts are unpersuasive, that they fail. I was simply trying to identify a familiar current. John Stuart Mill, for example, in his book Utilitarianism, tries to argue against the idea that utilitarians can't account for justice. I don't think those arguments work, so I agree very much with Bernard. On justice competing with other values, another example would be when justice competes with the need to reconstruct deeply divided societies. And so truth commissions, for example, in South Africa or in other places, in Rwanda, the question arises, should a society suspend the impulse to exact justice, even where great moral crimes have been committed, for the sake of getting on with reconstructing a society and living together? And here's where justice sometimes competes with forgiveness, or, for that matter, with the practical interest in binding together a society after heinous crimes have been committed in the course of a civil war or civil strife. Those pose I would say, some of the hardest questions about when the concern for punishing those who deserve punishment have to compete with and sometimes give way in the face of these other considerations.
Could I just say, Plato writes about justice in the Republic, in lots of it, and in the Socratic dialogues. I must say, one's head swims after a while. I mean, you don't know. It's a very slippery concept, and particularly as to whether it is a thing in itself, or whether it just represents this kind of suspension of claims. I mean, should we suspend claims and learn to live with each other, Michael, or should we pursue justice unto bloodshed, unto the last gasp, so to speak? But I mean, Socrates asks his friends, compare it to health, for example, or compare it to well-being or pleasure. What are our synonyms for justice, Professor Williams? What kind of a thing is this?
Well, I think that Plato did two things which we've got to bear in mind. One is that the word which he used, which is translated as justice, I think it's fair to say he hijacked it. He hijacked it to make it into the supreme virtue, both of states and individuals. And one of the consequences of his treatment is that it's pretty difficult to tell the difference between justice on the one hand and the other virtues on the other by the time he's finished, because he makes it cover such a wide ground. And that's certainly different from an approach in which the claims of justice, as Michael Sandel said, are one claim among others, they're a very important one. The second thing he did was that he wanted to give an account of justice which would apply both to states and to individuals. And that's absolutely central to his enterprise. He thought that what justice was in a society and what it was in a person was very strongly analogous. Now, we don't, on the whole, tend to believe that. We think that what we're saying when we say that a certain society is just is something really rather different from what we're saying about an individual person, because it's a question about how the state is organized, what sort of institutions it has, and so on. Whereas concerning an individual, we're talking about that person's willingness to go by certain rules, and so on.
Go ahead, Michael Sandel. Oh, no, I was just going to say, I mean, there's also this sense in which we fear justice. We fear a just God. It reminds me of the man facing the photographer who said, I don't want justice, I want mercy.
Sure.
I mean, what?
Sure.
That's
absolutely right. I mean, if, in the famous words of the poet, if everybody got justice, who would escape whipping? And
yeah, exactly.
Very important part of many religions, that in the end, justice in the sense of simply return for what you have done has to be transcended. But that's maybe a business for God. It's not a business for, or not always at any rate, a business for people's institutions.
Michael
Because you can't suddenly have a judge in a court who says, well, I think you deserve to go to prison for 30 years, but as a matter of fact, I'm feeling pretty merciful and you seem rather a sad case, I'll let you off. You can't do that.
Michael Sandel.
Here, I have a question I would like to throw out, and Bernard, and see how you would respond to this thought. The idea of fit, in many ways, the one that goes with the ancient world with Plato and Aristotle, is anathema to us moderns because we don't like the idea that nature design certain roles or purposes and ends that we're bound to adhere to.
Right.
And so that's lately a not very popular idea because we moderns believe in freedom, so we want theories of justice that don't depend on fit. But it seems to me that and I'd be interested to see if I could pin you down on this, can we do all together with the idea of fit, even though it has that defect?
I think that I agree with what I think you're saying, Michael, namely that the notion that we have thrown out on the whole is the idea that there are distinctions between groups of human beings as such, particularly between human beings, between, say, male and female, or between black and white, or barbarians and Greeks, and so on and so forth. We have thrown out the notion that there are distinctions which can ground what is fitting for each in that sense. That's absolutely true. We have not thrown out the notion that some conduct and institutions are appropriate to some people in virtue of those people's characteristics, and not appropriate to other people because of their characteristics. Nor do we have the idea, which is sometimes claimed by liberals, that the only way in which any given treatment is appropriate to an individual is because of that individual's voluntary behavior.
Right.
We don't believe that. We think, for instance, just turn it round. We now think that certain institutions and arrangements are appropriate, for instance, to gay people, which are gay people denied before, and we just think that's right in virtue of their equality with other human beings and their characteristic of being gay.
One example that comes to mind, and I agree with what Bernard has said, is the debate about affirmative action, say, in admissions to colleges and universities. There is one approach that would say we can decide that question based on our view of equality. And those who are against affirmative action say it's not giving everyone an equal chance to count race or gender, let's say, whereas others, defenders of affirmative action, might say, no, if you really believe in equality, then you will want a diverse student body. But it seems to me that those debates about affirmative action really are depend on one's view about what the proper purpose or end of a college or university is, and the qualities that are relevant to that purpose or end are the ones that can be counted in admissions decisions. And if that's true, then we're back to the idea of fitting those qualities to the purposes and ends, which are not any longer just read out from nature, but are the purposes and ends that we can argue are more or less appropriate, fitting to the practice of, say, higher education.
Justice at this point requires callers, 1-800-423-8255. In the second hour of our summer course on Western philosophy, we're talking about justice this hour with Bernard Williams in Oxford and Michael Sandel in our studio in Boston. The phone's 1-800-423-8255. Billy is calling from Virginia Beach, Virginia.
Hello, how are you?
Welcome, Billy. Good.
I'm an attorney in Virginia Beach. I was interested in the comment that someone wasn't interested in justice, they just want mercy, because we frequently tell our young lawyers, never ask a jury for justice because you're very likely to get it. I think that the problem is confusing or interchanging the words justice and a just society, because I don't believe they're interchangeable. A justice, at least from my point of view, is an abstract term that deals with individual rights, and because it's an abstract term, it's difficult to define, whereas trying to justify things or trying to talk about a just society is really just explaining necessary evils in society that may not be justice in the pure sense. The example of the affirmative action, for example, clearly is just something to justify or to talk about what is just based upon past indiscretions. It's not necessarily justice, but it certainly would justify and explain the necessary evil. And I think when you try to interchange the words justice and a just society, you end up with the problems of confusion, because justice is purely a term that can sometimes give way to explaining or justifying why we shouldn't prosecute heinous crimes or other political motivations that deal with trying to live in a just society without pure justice.
Michael Sandel.
I'm not sure I would separate a just society from justice to individuals quite as sharply as the caller would, but I do think that that he has a point there. If we think, for example, about the operation of a market economy, it produces certain distribution of income and wealth, and it's a question of justice whether that distribution should be reorganized by the society or left to lie as it falls. Now, it may be that even in a society that believes in redistributing income and wealth to a certain extent to provide everyone with a decent minimum, let's say, it might be that some of the people who wind up being very wealthy in a market economy, even with a fair baseline, a floor under the poor, it might be that some who become very wealthy are morally deserving and others not so morally deserving. So there is no guarantee, even in a just society, that income and wealth and the good things in life will necessarily accord with moral virtue understood from some ideal point of view.
Professor Williams, do you want to make a connection or disconnection between the just society and those individual claims to justice?
I think that what this questioner's remarks have brought out is the question that Michael and I had before us slightly earlier in this discussion, which is the relation of the notion of rights to a just society. This, again, is the issue of the individual and society here. One thing you can certainly say about a just society is that it doesn't violate people's rights, or at least it doesn't do so systematically, intentionally, and so on. It tries not to violate people's rights, okay? The question is, however, are there aims of a just society which go beyond even that? And I think that we might want to say there are. Because if you have people who are very poor, and poverty is inherited from one generation to another, or if, again, you have a lot of unemployment, you might well say that it's unfair to those people, and therefore that a policy of social justice would right to change the situation. But it's not absolutely clear that the reason you say that is because they have a right to be better off. They don't have their rights violated in the same way as if they're thrown into prison without a trial.
Michael, we talked a lot about Plato and Aristotle. What is the contemporary philosophical view or ideal or utopia about justice and the just society?
Well, one way of expressing it, and here the most influential contemporary theorist of justice, philosopher, is John Rawls, whose famous book, A Theory of Justice, reinvigorated discussion within philosophy about justice in the 20th century. And his basic idea is that a just society is one that respects people's rights to choose their own ends and values for themselves, so long as they don't infringe other people's rights to do the same. That's what it amounts to. It's a very familiar and powerful idea of justice in contemporary society. It places a great emphasis on rights, and it also departs from the ancient understandings of justice of Plato and Aristotle in this respect. The idea is not to fit people's identities to certain roles given by nature. It's to respect the fact that we are free and independent selves capable of choosing our end for ourselves. So the basic framework of a just society doesn't take sides in debates about religion or in debates about what is the best life to live. The ancients, Plato and Aristotle, took it for granted that you couldn't even begin to talk about justice or the just society or a just constitution without first inquiring into the best way of living for a person. And what the moderns do, and it's given very powerful expression in the work of John Rawls, is to say, no, those are two separate questions. The best way of life, what's worthy for human beings, that's a matter for individuals to decide for themselves or within their religious communities or within their families. It's a separate question what a just society looks like, and it's one very important feature of a just society, on this contemporary view, that it be neutral with respect to contending religions and contending ideas about what makes life worth living. This is one of the great fault lines between ancient and contemporary theories of justice, and the challenge is, the controversy now in contemporary political philosophy is, can you sever those two ideas so completely, justice from the good life?
Interesting. It sounds that the Rawls theory is based not just on rights, but located in individuals, especially in the Judeo-Christian tradition of sort of a community of God or a community of God's people. What are the claims in the Rawlsian system of the society itself, of the community itself, of the social organism?
Well, what's required of the society as a whole is not that it affirm any particular religion. The purpose of law is not to make better people, not to cultivate virtue, as in some of the earlier ancient, classical, and also religious conceptions of justice. It's not to make people better or to equip them for salvation or anything of the kind. And instead, it has what you might think of as a more modest aim. We live in pluralist societies in the modern world. We're never going to agree on law or on constitutions if it's premised on some vision of human flourishing or of religion. And so what we want from a society is that it be fair to individuals and groups as they go about the enterprise of choosing their own religions and values and visions of the good life for themselves. It's a modest claim, scaling down, in a way, the claims of justice. Whether you can have that, whether you can actually defend principles of justice that are neutral with respect to questions of the good life or the meaning of life, that is a big and difficult question. I myself am skeptical whether you can separate them so
Professor
clearly.
Williams, do you accept that definition of sort of the modern notion of justice as being rights-based or defined in terms of rights and based in the individual?
Well, I want to make, if I may, one, as it seems to me, correction, disagreement with Michael about the exposition of Rawls himself. He's quite right in saying that Rawls wants to separate questions of justice of society from the pursuit of the good. There's a lot in that. But in fact, Rawls' system entirely depends upon the citizens having one particular kind of virtue, that they themselves should have a sense of fairness, because it's only if the citizens have a sense of fairness that they will be able to participate freely in these institutions which try to treat the populace as a whole fairly, and in fact, in certainly the earlier versions of Rawls' theory, involve quite a lot of redistribution. Now, my own view, I agree that Rawls overdoes the distinction between the good and the right in that sense, but actually I think that he curiously shares a property with traditional political philosophy, that it isn't political enough. That is, that it's an entirely moral theory applied to society about what would be a fair outcome. Whereas, as a matter of fact, we have to take seriously the history of our conceptions. Now, I do think that a strong respect for rights, for individuals, and for freedom of people to determine the value of their lives is an inescapable requirement of a free community and a just community in the modern world. But I think that that's partly due to features of the modern world. It's due to the results of the Enlightenment and the revolutions that went with it. Now, indeed, they may well be a good thing anyway, but sure, we're stuck with them.
Professor Williams,
to run a world on other principles now couldn't lead to anything except tyranny. So Rawls correctly articulates, up to a point, principles which are those of the modern world, as it seems to me.
Stand by for callers, 1-800-423-8255. The Justice Connection. John is on the line.
Hi there.
Welcome, John.
Welcome. Good to hear this topic. It's one I think about more than from time to time. It seems to me that justice, the concept of it is subsumed under a much larger heading and title, and that is, what is reality? When you ask, in any court system, assumes there is some objective reality to measure, did it happen, did it not happen? Did he take it, did he not take it? Was this person murdered or were they not? Who did it? How did it happen? There's some objective reality implied to determine, did it, the fundamental question is, what is reality? Did it happen? Did it exist? And just as they say, all politics are local, I think all justice is primarily an individual, between individuals. Who took Tommy's baseball glove? Did you take it? You have to pay back. You have to make restitution. There's the questions that are asked are very simple questions, basically. What are we? What are rights?
Those are the trial questions. Are those the philosophical questions?
Well, it is very important to determine the facts in order to do justice, but it's not enough to determine the facts, because knowing that one person killed another person, establishing that in a court, leaves open the moral question about the degree of culpability and therefore what the appropriate punishment is. So you can take the example of two would-be assassins, one who succeeds and the other who tries but pulls the trigger but the gun doesn't work. They both intended the same outcome, though one produced it and the other didn't. So from the standpoint of the facts, one is guilty, the other is innocent, and yet we do punish, though not as severely, the would-be assassin, even though the murder didn't occur.
Depends also on what state he's tried in. He may get hung in one and given a life sentence in the next. 1-800-423-8255 makes the justice connection. Imran is on the line.
Hi. I just want to kind of, I guess, remind viewers, I guess, from Bernard Lewis a couple nights ago, who said that the assumption that perhaps our form of governance, such as democracy, is the right one is kind of ludicrous. And it was in the context of comparing Islamic societies. And what I want to bring out is the idea that just even recently in Nigeria, where you had, I think, a city elect to have Sharia law, I guess much to the consternation of some of the Christian communities, kind of raises the idea that, justice is relative depending on what standard you choose to adopt. And I think, one thing that I've always kind of thought an interesting point that comes out every once in a while in different media is the idea of the fundamental or the Islamic State, which gets equated with the fundamentalist state. But I think truly, in the true Islamic spirit of peace and tolerance, the idea of Sharia is really one which tries to create equity in society. And there is this notion called dhimmi, which is, I guess, translates into the protected class, which is supposed to be a duty owed to minority classes. Typically, it has been Christians or Jews in the Muslim state. And the fact that Muslims, in order to be better people, actually, in that practice, would owe a greater duty to protect the minority status. And I think...
Imran, what's the question here about justice?
Well, the point is that, justice is really kind of a relative term. And the fact that you owe duty to another person kind of raises the issue of what kind of justice is meted out to that person, or how do you mete out justice in that context?
But,
Professor Williams?
Well, I think there's the question as remarks raised, absolutely two different questions. One is there is a question about whether an Islamic system of justice is, and we're speaking here particularly, I think, of criminal and retributive justice, is better than the kind of systems that we have in England or America. Then themselves are different from one another, of course. Well, that's a discussable issue, obviously, and there's much to be said about that. But I must say the business of trying to import the Islamic system of justice into America as a whole, just like that, would seem to me a rather unlikely project, and you're unlikely to bring it off without a great deal of tyranny. But the other issue is the quite different issue of relativism, which was mentioned, namely, should we agree that Islamic systems of justice are fine for Islamic states, whereas our system of justice is fine for ours? Now, that's a quite different question, and that raises, of course, the question about what counts as the sort of society for which the Islamic system of justice is appropriate. And as the question reminded us, of course, there's also an issue about which Islamic system of justice, since there's more than one such. And that's a very important issue because, of course, societies are very unlikely to be absolutely unanimous about that. And if we have citizens in Islamic states who are complaining about injustice with regard to perhaps certain Islamic institutions, what are we supposed to do about it? Are we supposed to say, we do not listen to you, we do not hear you, we do not have anything to say about it because you live in an Islamic state? That seems to leave out the point that Islamic states' citizens can disagree with one another just as they can disagree with one another in the United States.
Michael Sandel.
The caller's question about the religious law being installed as the law of a state brings us back in a way to the question about the way in which different religious traditions have understood justice in civil society as inseparable from the question of morality and religion. So the general category of such systems, be they Jewish law, Islamic law, Christian law, they don't seem to work very well for pluralist societies where people disagree, and that's what gives rise to the ambition in contemporary political theory, as we were discussing before, to have law not take sides. It's true, as Bernard Williams said before, that the virtue of being fair to others, respecting their conceptions, is a kind of virtue that liberal regimes promote. But I would disagree with him or make this amendment, but that's a very, very limited idea of virtue as to be embodied in law from the one that's embodied in Islamic law, Christian law, Jewish law, or classical conceptions of law.
1-800-423-8255 makes the justice connection with Bernard Williams and Michael Sandel. Dorothy is on the line.
Hi, Chris.
Welcome, Dorothy.
How are you?
Good.
Good. I wanted to make a comment on a book I read a few years ago, a lovely little book, mostly written for grade school children, but the title is Whatever Happened to Justice, and it's written by Richard Mayberry.
What was the answer?
He broke it down to very simple laws, two fundamental laws that were written during the writing of the Constitution. And the first law is do all you have agreed to do. And the second law is do not encroach on other people or their property. And I think that trims it down very easily, and I know it helps me in my day-to-day life just deciding what's right and what's wrong. Simple little things like, can I be a little bit late for work, or can I do this? And I think of those two laws, and it helps me.
Now, should we ascribe this to Jefferson, the Jeffersonian spirit?
Sure, yeah. Yeah, and because justice has, the definition of justice has become very complicated, and it gets very muddled, and I think if we brought a little simplicity back to it, it would just make life a lot easier for a lot of people.
Dorothy, I'm going to remember that. Bernard Williams?
Can I ask Dorothy a question? Yeah, I absolutely agree in sort of solid rules of that kind, but I want to know what encroach means. This is a problem that the philosopher John Stuart Mill in the 19th century had terrible trouble with. What counts as encroaching? For instance, if I sit in my garden not wearing very many clothes, and my neighbour who oversees the garden doesn't like the look of me and is very upset, have I encroached on him or not?
I would say no.
I would say no, too. But it's a very good question where you draw the line.
Yeah. But
the serious point is, almost everything that anybody does affects other people somehow. Mm-hmm. We can't say that our acts are divided into those that affect other people and those that don't, because they almost all do somehow in a society, you know. So the question is, we have to draw the line around the impact on other people that they have a right to resist, and the impact on other people they don't have a right to resist, and that's really where the problem starts. So encroach doesn't quite solve it for us.
Two contemporary controversies that raise this question are the debate about gay marriage, because some people argue that the case for gay marriage should be entirely consist in the fact that it doesn't hurt the people who are engaged in other kinds of marriages. So what's the harm? What's the encroachment? Whereas others say, no, that's an encroachment on the institution of marriage that undermines social values and the value of heterosexual traditional marriages. Another example is the debate about hate speech. Does hate speech count as an action that can encroach on the rights of those who are slurred or vilified by the hate speech? And whether or not it should count as free speech depends in large part on where one draws that line.
Dorothy, thank you. 1-800-423-8255, the Justice Connection. Larry is on the line.
Good morning.
Good morning, Larry.
I have a comment. I think the show Survivor, which is on one of the major channels and is drawing a lot of interest across the country, is a very dangerous program, and I think it's interesting that the major networks would sponsor such a show. I was in the military, and through basic training was taught that we had to survive as a team. at all costs, and we would support, in terms of justice, each other. And that show is very, very interesting. I'd like your insight as to that show. Thank you.
Yeah, this is the show that's referred to as where Lord of the Flies meets Real World. Or Gilligan's Island, or something. Larry, I can't profess to know the show Survivor. Do you, Michael?
I don't know it at all, but it does bring to mind a different actual case of a law case involving survivors, the lifeboat case, which raises some of the questions of justice that we've been discussing about. 4 people stuck on a lifeboat at sea, they're starving, they have no food. The only way they can survive is to kill the cabin boy and eat him, which they did. This is a real-life case of survivors. I suppose if the networks knew about it, they might try to replicate it and put it on television, and it would gain great ratings. But the question for justice faced the court in England, whether or not these cannibals at sea acted out of necessity and so morally should be excused, or whether murder is murder and they should be punished.
And the answer is, Professor Williams?
My view is that murder is murder and they shouldn't be punished.
And they shouldn't be punished.
That is, there's a case in which they're convicted of murder, but the duress is such that the penalty should be of a more nominal character. I mean, mercy should be extended to them.
Do you think it would make a good BBC television program, Bernard?
But I guess in the Survivor series, you can be thrown off the island for being boring or just for the ratings
I don't
going
know
down.
this show, of course, is this American show. I mean, this is a sort of balloon game. It's a question of who you throw out and or something.
We know all your shows. You should know ours, Professor Williams. I mean,
I do.
1-800-423-8255. Matthew is on the line.
Good morning, Chris.
Morning, Matthew.
It seems to me there are 2 different dimensions in what is being said this morning. One has to do with what is right and what is wrong, and that's really tough. But there's a structural element, too, to what is justice, and I think it does go back to Aristotle or earlier, and that is the simple proposition that justice means equal laws for equal deeds and different laws for different deeds. And I think that that's a principle which, although applied to individuals in most of our minds, is of very great importance in the coming 100 years in order to try to curb the excesses of states. There is a branch of law which applies this Aristotelian concept to individuals, whoever they are, heads of state or private persons. It's called universal jurisdiction.
Yes.
It's what got Senator Pinochet into trouble. And people who commit those specific crimes, slavery, piracy, torture, hostage-taking, and certain other crimes, are called hostis humani generis, enemies of all humanity. In other words, there we do have the notion of right and wrong, but it's based on norms that are almost universal. It seems to me that in the future, we need to get back to this old Aristotelian notion of equal laws for equal deeds and different laws for different deeds, so that when a nation misbehaves, it's not a nation, it's the leadership of the nation. To go to war causes enormous damage to everybody, propagates the hatreds, they continue. To hold the individual, the head of state, or those responsible as criminals who are responsible may be a slower remedy, but it's one we need to emphasize in the future.
Matthew, you end the conversation on a high plane and a forward vision. I thank you. I thank you, Michael Sandel, for joining us in the studio, Bernard Williams for joining us by phone from Oxford. Listeners, our philosophy series continues next Wednesday, June 28th. We'll be talking about ethics and morality. I'm Christopher Lydon. This is The Connection from WBUR Boston.